the neighbor who disappeared. The setting sun was slowly gliding over the century-old building in front of her, shedding a halo of orange-red light as Carla Hunter carried the last box of books into her new apartment. It was a quiet apartment building on the edge of some nondescript town in Ohio, with a mottled appearance of brick walls, but with a different kind of old-world charm. Kara felt that this was just the place for her to start over, away from the chaos of her divorce and the hustle and bustle of the city. Everything was so perfect it was disturbing. She stood in the living room and surveyed her surroundings, the wooden floors creaking from age as if whispering something. The corners of each room appeared to be slightly slanted, and there was a patch of water stains on the ceiling. But none of this frightened her. Instead, there was a strange sense of intimacy, as if the house was welcoming her. Carla was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she suddenly heard a soft tapping in the direction of the bedroom, a slow but firm rhythm. She stopped moving so violently that the spatula almost fell from her hand. "Who is it?" she shouted, but all that answered her was silence. That tapping ended abruptly as she walked to the bedroom and pulled the door open. The bedroom was empty. The only strange thing about it was the glass in the window. A thin crack had appeared as if some invisible force had tried to break it. The next morning, Carla was walking with a cup of coffee to the small garden in front of the apartment building when she met an old man who looked to be in his 70s or 80s. He was leaning on an old wooden cane and had a wrinkled face squished together. "You're new here, aren't you?" the old man asked in a raspy voice. Kara nodded and smiled. "Yeah, this place looks nice." The old man grinned, but didn't answer again. Instead, his gaze fell on one of the windows of the apartment. Following his gaze, Kara realized that it was a window on the top floor, with a crack in the glass as well, almost identical to the one on her bedroom window. "Who lives in that apartment?" Kara asked. "No one lives there." The old man shook his head, his expression becoming rigid. "That's the empty house. It's been empty for 10 years. Kara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it, just nodded and smiled before turning to leave. When she got back to her apartment, she opened the building's mailbox, only to find that the mail from the other residents in the building had never been picked up. Some of the letters even went back a few years. Late at night, the apartment was surprisingly quiet, and Kara was the only one awake. She lay in bed, her eyes staring at the ceiling in disbelief. Suddenly, that soft tapping sound started again, this time coming from the living room wall. The tapping was regular, like a message. She tried to ignore it, covering her ears with a pillow, but the tapping grew more and more urgent, almost as if it were an angry protest against her indifference. Eventually, she relented, lifted the covers, and walked barefoot into the living room. "What do you want?" she asked in a low voice, trying to sound as calm as possible. The walls responded to her with a clearer sound, a sharp, piercing sound as if fingernails were scratching through wood. Kara leaned closer to the wall and faintly heard whispers coming from the other side. She leaned over and pressed her ear against the cold wall. "Leave!" came a hoarse voice from behind the wall, faint but desperate. Kara jerked back and dropped to the floor, her chest heaving violently. She settled down, rushed to the kitchen to get a knife, and pried a small, thin plank of wood from the wall. Her heart almost stopped. The void in the wall was stuffed with moldy rag dolls and old papers, and underneath the rag dolls was a broken finger of human bone. The next day, Carla took her findings to the town library. She looked through old files about the apartment and finally found a name: Allison Faye. Allison was a teenage girl who had lived in the apartment. The file mentioned that she had disappeared one night in 1983, and the police had never been able to locate her. However, witnesses claimed that she was last seen standing by the top floor window with a blank expression and mumbling. What was even creepier about cold sweat break out on her forehead. She grabbed her cell phone and tried to dial 911, but the signal bar went blank. The screen suddenly lit up with a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Don't run, Carla." Her hand shook and the phone fell to the floor. The next second, there was a loud crash of breaking glass from the direction of the bedroom, as if someone had smashed through the window with tremendous force. Kara rushed into the bedroom to find the window dark, but a cold wind was pouring relentlessly into the room. Just as she approached the window, the door to the room slammed shut. She turned around in horror to find a figure reflected in the mirror. A girl, her hair disheveled to cover her face, wearing an old yellow dress. The girl's head lifted little by little, revealing empty sockets, and the corners of her mouth slowly widened into a twisted smile. "Help me," the girl whispered, but the voice sounded like an echo from the ground, cold and harsh. Kara screamed and ran out of the bedroom and back into the living room. However, there was a sudden, violent vibration in the floor and she slipped and fell to the ground. The wooden floor cracked, and a putrid odor came from between the cracks. She realized that there was a skeleton that had turned black buried underground, and those bones seemed to be writhing slightly. Not daring to stay, she climbed up and rushed to the door, pulling the lock with all her might, but the door would not budge. The cracks in the wall grew, as if the whole apartment was breathing. Just as she was about to despair, heavy footsteps came from upstairs, coming closer and closer and finally stopping above her head. After the footsteps disappeared, she heard someone whisper her name, "Carla." The voice was low and carried an eerie familiarity, like a memory from her own past retelling something that hadn't happened. She turned her head to look up the stairwell and realized that the window on the top floor was glowing with a faint light. Kara finally gathered her courage and made her way up the spiral staircase to the top floor. Each step creaked underfoot, as if protesting her proximity. The door to the top floor stood open, and behind it was a dated children's room with faded cartoon stickers covering the walls and rows of rag dolls on the floor. The eyes of those rag dolls were gouged out, as if they were watching her silently. A huge, broken mirror stood in the center of the room. Kara took a step towards the mirror and realized that what was reflected in it was not herself, but the figure of the girl. The girl's hand slowly reached out of the mirror and pointed behind her. Kara stiffly turned around and saw the cracks in the wall growing larger and larger, eventually collapsing completely, revealing a dark abyss inside. There were countless blurred figures in the abyss, their faces twisted and their mouths constantly whispering, "Stay, Kara." Her screams ended abruptly as an invisible force pulled her into the abyss. A few days later, new tenants moved into the apartment, and the enthusiastic agent assured them that it was absolutely quiet and cozy, and Carla's room remained as it was, as if it had never been occupied. That night, a thin crack was added to the tenant's bedroom window,